Dr. Lucy Reynolds is going to be speaking this evening, but she hasn't arrived yet, so we're just going to kick off so as not to waste time. The format of this meeting is the experts at the front are going to speak for 8 minutes each. And we've got Rachel from Unite and Linda Korscher, who's an independent researcher on free trade agreements. When Lucy comes along, she'll be speaking about the Health and Social Care Act and what's been happening to the NHS over the last few years. Each speaker will speak for about 8 minutes each. Then we'll have some time for questions and answers from the floor and contributions for the floor. I'd be really grateful if you kept those contributions quite short, because there are lots of people here this evening and we want to get through as much as possible. The last section of the evening, from 8 o'clock or just before 8 o'clock, is going to focus on action planning, and that's really the most important part of this evening, so I want to leave as much time for that as possible, really. We'll talk about how we can jointly stop the tip and certainly exempt the NHS from that free trade agreement. If you can't hear me at any point, or if there's anything you need to let me know about, please just raise your hand. Thanks. Okay, I'll be really grateful if Rachel can kick off. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm sorry if my voice cuts out. I've got a horrible bug, so I'll see how I keep going. And thanks ever so much for turning out tonight. What I want to do really is just to talk about what's happening in the NHS and how we're responding to that. So in particular, I'll just be talking about the NHS in England, because of course we did have one NHS, now we have 4 different NHSs. So NHS Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have been exempt from the perils of privatisation to the extent we've seen in England. It doesn't mean that there has been absolutely no private involvement, because there has, but not at the same level. So I'll be talking the story of the NHS in England, and obviously then linking it through to TTIP and why this is just so important that we build a campaign around it. The Health and Social Care Act came first of all we had the white paper from the government straight after the Tories were elected, and right at the start, despite Lansley saying there will be no privatisation, we heard that from Cameron as well, privatisation was introduced in the white paper, liberating the NHS. Then came the Health and Social Care Bill in January 2011, which again very much predicated on a third part of the bill around privatisation. And then we had the Health and Social Care Act passed by Parliament in 2012, March 2012, and now it obviously is in statute. As a result of that, there is a real impact on what's happening in the NHS. But we can't fool ourselves to say everything is predicated on the bill, because the reality is a lot of the privatisation was already happening. In fact, we only have to go back to Margaret Thatcher's days, to realise that actually privatisation was brought into the NHS under her rule. So first of all, we had the privatisation of catering services and cleaning services, and then we moved on to see a lot of the non-clinical services being privatised. So we had things like the labs going out to the private sector and other services, estates departments. We then had, of course, PFIs, and of course under PFIs we have these huge contracts going to conglomerates, to consortia of different organisations. Many of them we all know as household names, as companies not with the best reputation around employment rights, and certainly not associated with the health sector, now running sections of the NHS. And what the Health and Social Care Act did was then open that up, the private sector, to all services, including clinical services. So that was the major change. So the whole of the NHS in England is now susceptible to privatisation. And even after the Act, there were the regulations to work out about how the Act will be implemented. And Regulation 75 pinned down basically that every single service has to go out to a competitive tendering process, and therefore the private sector very much being welcomed in. 70% of contracts since April have now gone out to the private sector. So that is the pace and the rapid pace of change of privatisation. Now these any qualified providers only need to get a licence from a body called Monitor, the regulator of the NHS, and then they can operate within the NHS. And therefore we've now got a market within the NHS with many organisations providing those services. Privatisation has happened elsewhere, so just the normal thing that we're used to these days in the public sector, services just being put up for tender and then going out to private services. We're now seeing hospital takeovers, and they're going through Parliament at the moment. We have Clause 118 of the Care Bill, which is opening up the opportunity for hospitals which fail financially then to be able to find some options for delivering those services in the future. So we could say that trying to speed up the pace of privatisation, because figures out over the weekend were showing that a third of hospitals are now going to be in serious financial deficit at the end of this year. So once the Care Act is passed, and if the 118 isn't stopped, then we could see even another tranche of pushing privatisation. In the Health and Social Care Act, it invited up to 49% of NHS services to be delivered by the private sector. And then we have other organisations now saying they're not delivering services on the NHS. York Clinical Commissioning Group would be an example of that, where they've stopped providing some of the services which they would have done traditionally, and said, but there's a nice little private hospital down the road and you can go there and get your services. So we are seeing this whole culture now which is being orientated to the market. The danger around that is that obviously we know the cost of privatisation, growing inequality in health outcomes. We see obviously the cost, financial cost to us as taxpayers, and what we see obviously terms and conditions of the workforce being deteriorated, and that's already being witnessed with services which have been outsourced and new starters in those organisations being asked to sign contracts with a far worse value. On top of that, though, we now have the TTIP, the EU-US trade agreement, and that will basically mean that any privatisation that has happened, and the fact that we already have a market system in the health service, means that the private sector will be able to challenge further for those services and then won't be able to reverse those services, because the multinationals will then challenge domestic governments like the UK government and say, even if our dreams come true and a future government does want to bring the NHS back into the public domain, it won't be able to, because these companies, they won't even be able to afford the legal bills of some of these companies, multinational companies, who will take them on. And we've already seen the startings of that. And if we look at the impact that Philip Morris had, when obviously they took a challenge in Australia around plain packaged tobacco, the challenge there is that you can't actually take public health measures. So you can't direct policy on health policy, public health policy, things that will improve people's lives. Domestic governments will deny that, but also won't be able to control the fiscal direction of its economy and how it provides public services. So at every measure, there will be a real risk, obviously, to us, and we will have no control. In fact, there'll be very hardly any point in voting for a government of Westminster, because it will have no control over the NHS, but also, if we go further than that, public services. If we go on that, also we'll be looking at the way that it can integrate with the private sector. For instance, at the moment within public procurement, you can have things called social clauses, which can help with the local economy, employing long-term unemployed in the local area, looking at good quality labour rights. These things will be diluted as a result. And basically government will have no voice in the direction it takes things. So within TTIP, there are a real threat, and for trade unionists, obviously we are very much focused on what's happening in the NHS, because United has been campaigning right from the start of this bill coming through, right through, with a very clear stance against privatisation. We will continue that in the light of what's happened, but also really concerned about what will happen around labour rights. We've already seen a deregulation agenda, and this is what TTIP is really about. It's about deregulation, not just about the tariff agenda and reducing tariffs between trading of different nations. And under deregulation, we'll see the loss around equality rights, we'll see the loss around health and safety rights, and of course employment rights and employment protection. And under a government like ours, if they have got the freedom and they're supported by multinational business to cut terms and conditions of ordinary workers, then it will go ahead and do that. And of course it will make the NHS unsustainable from a staffing point of view and put the staff at risk as well. So we'll see a race to the bottom in labour rights, which obviously, as we have seen so much over the last year or so, Wednesday being the anniversary of Robert Francis's report, will have an impact on patient care. So at every single angle that you look at it, this is bad for the NHS, it's bad for the staff, it's bad for patients, and it's bad for the taxpayers. So just kind of setting out the agenda, there is not a lot in this TTIP to recommend, but obviously the irreversibility issue is so massive for all of us that we have got to see this off, because the ambition is that the end of the negotiating period is at the end of this year, and as a result of that, if we don't take to our feet, take to the streets and fight back on this, then we may lose our NHS forever.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful, thank you. Lucy, are you okay to go next?
Sure.
Thanks.
Evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Okay, I've been asked to speak a little bit about the content and the effects of the Health and Social Care Act and its links to TTIP. So I'm going to cover some of the same ground that Rachel did, with a little bit more detail on framing and some specifics about what's in this act, because, you know, it was missold to us all. It's really taken quite some time to work out exactly what things do, so I thought I'd let you know in sort of note points what it does. Okay, so this Health and Social Care Act and the TTIP and various other issues of this kind around Section 75 and so forth need to be seen as part of a global process of rolling back the state. Different parts of the world have been done at different times. There was a debt crisis, that did most of the third world. There was transition from communism, that did Eastern Europe and Russia. And it's Europe's turn with an austerity narrative. So this is a global initiative which has been pushed by big business, and, you know, when they get gains, they're happy. When they get pushed back, they wait and they try again through a different way. So the vision in its current marketing format is called the Big Society. Now, you may remember being told about the Big Society, but not really hearing very much detail about what that was going to envisage. Well, I found some internal documents the other day, and then an expose from Australia where it is also the current narrative, and I found out what it means. It means the takeover of the public sector by the private sector, and any other public services that are required that the private sector doesn't choose to offer, because it doesn't have to, will be serviced by philanthropy or religious efforts or those kinds of things. So basically, the same situation on health that we had before the NHS, and it'll have the same things wrong with it. So, specifically, the Health and Social Care Act 2012 was the implementation of the final stage of the Thatcher Plan. There has been continuity since the mid to late 80s on this. Actually, there's been continuity arguably for a lot longer. 1970 is another starting point people seem to give. There has been continual waves of aggression against the NHS, actually, and they always push the same plan. So this is the current iteration of it. What we have seen through the last few administrations was the systematic implementation, starting with picking off the easy bits like the catering services, and then we have set out in that plan from the 1980s really a listing of all of the things we've seen since, and an explanation of how they are privatisation moves or how they benefit the larger plan. Because the larger plan is, as always, to have primary care services taken over by the insurance industry, and secondary care services, which means when you actually see doctors and other kinds of clinicians and services, by the private healthcare industry or whatever is ancillary to that. Private equity is also getting involved with a lot of things which are termed to be social enterprise or charities, but they've kind of worked out ways to make money out of them. So that's what's going on. So the specific plan, which is embodied in the Health and Social Care Act 2012, is for an insurance industry takeover of the NHS, with a long phase of pre-harmonisation which has taken place already, called marketisation, which has been preparing it for emergence as a clone of the US healthcare industry round about 2020. So that's when things are supposed to be completed. And 2020 is also a very important deadline for the EU plans. So what's in the Health and Social Care Act? Firstly, you'll be aware that it creates clinical commissioning groups. Now those were designed by John Redwood, who appears to be denying it, but it's all written up. And the Adam Smith Institute, no less, has credited him with the authorship of this plan. They are designed to be a transitional arrangement to enable an invisible insurance industry takeover of the bits of our GP services, primary care services, that it wants. So I'm sure Richmond is going to be popular, and Hampstead. Rural areas won't be popular because they're not economically viable. But under the new system, unfortunately, we're not allowed to interfere with the market any longer. The Dutch government tried to interfere with the market by doing something, the GP Association tried to interfere with the market by doing something about the fact that there were no longer any rural healthcare services because they turned the whole thing over to the market. And they were fined €7.7 million and told to desist. So it's turned the whole thing over to the market. Many of you are aware of the competition law regulations, section 75, which have the effect of putting all NHS payment for services, which means staff costs, it's people doing things. It's not bandages and hospital beds. It's when people do stuff. That's what's at stake at the moment, the services part. And that forces all procurement to be done under EU competition laws, and those were drawn up by the big corporates to favour themselves in this rolling back the state process. You'll also be aware, probably many of you, of Clause 1, the hand washing clause, which was a big wish from the corporate sector that government should devolve all responsibility down to the markets. So that's a more or less formal severance. There is an instruction that goes once a year, officially. That's all that the government is allowed to do for the NHS in terms of managing it. There is an autonomy clause which says that the providers in this new arrangement can do as they please. So that means that within the terms of the contract, if it's not written into the contract and it's not a subject of ordinary criminal laws and so forth, they can run things the way they want. So if you forget to specify it, which has happened with a lot of NHS contracts because we don't have qualified people on the NHS side organising the contracts. So the contracts are bad, and that's why we are getting ripped off every which way, and that is planned to continue with the way CCGs have been set up to do their work, unfortunately. It provides, thanks to a late amendment, for data export to unspecified recipients without any provision for recovery of the costs involved in collecting it, without any provision to share in any money that's made from exploiting that data, or any credits, and no explanation of who this data is going to go to. There's basically absolutely no limit. Private detectives, for example, no limits. It provides for cheap layoff of NHS staff. They've really got very little protection once they transfer over. It's very minimal and not for very long. And generally it lays out the whole of NHS service provision on a market stall for the purchasing. It undoes all of the constraints that kept these services as public sector, and it just lays them all out. There we are, there's the market. Another last very important item which is in this is that it makes special provisions to allow the fire sale of NHS land and buildings, which McKinsey has been recommending for some time. They have put the whole lot of the NHS properties into a company, then they declared that the budget wasn't big enough, oops, and they were going to have to sell them all in a fire sale. How convenient. So that's happened already. So the link between the Thatcher Plan and TTIP specifically it's all layers of the same thing. The idea really within the global rollback agenda is that they like countries' governments to do the dirty work before Washington gets directly involved. So that's really why we've had this. They were told to do that a couple of years ago, and that's the reason for it. So what we see in Health and Social Care Act is an attempt to tip the whole thing into the market. That's also the goal of TTIP. This is the general trade agenda. The last thing to mention, I'm sure my colleagues will explain further, But the reason we're seeing these regional trade agendas, trade agreements being sewn together at the moment is because the global activists managed to derail the global process at Doha some years back, and they haven't managed to get it restarted. So it's been defeated before, it can be defeated again if we can get ourselves organised. It is really not an impossible task. They want us to think it is, it isn't. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. Linda, thanks.
Well, that was pretty heavy stuff from Lucy, but wait till I start. What I want to do is make some general remarks about international trade agreements, and then talk about 4 aspects of trade agreements, how they relate to the NHS, 2 that are in all free trade agreements, and 2 that are specific to the TTIP. So, it's in, for all trade agreements are about setting neoliberalism in stone forever, so there's no going back on it. Regardless of what governments you get in the future. That is the point of trade agreements. They're promoted by transnational corporations and for the benefit of transnational corporations, and particularly financial services. So you realise that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here might be like health companies up front, but it's investment stuff. So the City of London, representing transnational financial services, has a very big voice in EU free trade agreements. So free trade agreements lock us into international trade law. And 2 things about that. International trade law is above national law and EU law. It's right up there. And also that free trade, that international trade law only runs on the values of free trade. So there's no environment, human rights, social stuff in there. It's right up there, the top level of law in that sense, and it's only running on the values of free trade. Locked in to international trade law means, as I pointed out, regardless of future governments. So the idea is that there's no reversals, that it gives corporate security. So 4 things in trade deals affecting the NHS. The first one I want to talk about is the big global public procurement grab. This is transnational corporations seeking rights to public procurement is all government spending at all government levels. So this is transnational corporations seeking rights to all government spending. So getting in on the investment opportunities with government spending, because government spending is pretty secure investment generally compared with anything else. When they have that right to bid for contracts or for takeovers or whatever, with their economies of scale and with their access to cheap labour and with their access to credit, they can suck up all the contracts and squash out the SMEs and the charities. Despite the spin you always get about SMEs, the trade agreements are good for SMEs, they get squashed out by transnational corporations. The second thing I want to talk about is liberalisation, something that's often said but rarely explained. What it means is just opening investment opportunities to transnational and foreign corporations. Now you will have noticed that the UK is the most liberalised country in the universe. Here everything is always liberalised, it's not even mentioned, it's taken for granted that every investment opportunity is open to foreign companies. The result in the private sector, as we see, is that everything is foreign owned, we don't own anything anymore. In the privatised public sector, we see the corporations coming in for PFI, for contracts, for takeovers. So Thames Water is owned by Canadian pension funds. South African corporations are big in PFIs, and we've got big US health companies and health investors coming in the NHS. Now when liberalisations that's opening to transnational investors. When that's put into trade agreements like TTIP, the commitment is to keep that service open to transnational investment. So here's the trick. It's the commitment to keep the service open to transnational investment permanently. And in that process, the privatisations underpinning the liberalisation becomes irreversible. So currently the Health and Social Care Act is national legislation, but once it's in the TTIP, it's subject to the liberalisation commitments. So the liberalisation and the privatisation in it become irreversible. The third thing I want to talk about specific to TTIP is that it's been mentioned that TTIP is specifically about harmonising regulation between the US and the EU. And the NHS has already been harmonised. I was in Brussels a few years before the Act came in, and health was targeted then as the primary target, health for harmonisation. As I say, at this point, the Act is national level, but into TTIP it's irreversible. The last thing I want to talk about is investor-state dispute settlement in TTIP that allows corporations to sue governments for the loss of their expected profits resulting from any regulatory changes or backtracking. So this will keep all this in place and prevent any reversals, despite what the Labour Party is promising about reversing the Act. It's kept in place because of the threat of big payouts to corporations from the public purse. I was asked to mention the fact that the Trade Commission has just announced a moratorium and a consultation on the ISDS, but it's a very long drawn out thing. The rest of the negotiations continue in the meantime, and it's only a consultation on loopholes in investor-state dispute settlement. So it's not in there the possibility of it being taken right out at this stage anyway. There is a campaign across the EU and US civil society groups to stop the trade agreement, and recent videos of the Trade Commissioner de Gucht shows that he looks like he's kind of cracking up, but he's not the power behind it, the corporations are. So I don't know whether the TTIP will be stopped or not. There's a lot of people trying. But in case it's not stopped, I feel strongly that we need the NHS exempt from the TTIP as the way to go.
Okay. Great. Can people hear me all right if I don't have the mic on? Fantastic, because I don't like using it. Right, so thanks to everyone that has spoken. That was really illuminating overview about the rolling back of the state and corporate security that this free trade agreement is going to bring in. I'm not sure if any of the speakers mentioned, but the NHS is $100 billion a year prize for investors. So you can see how significant it is and how exempting the NHS from the free trade agreement might potentially, as a strategy, may help to unravel the whole thing. I want to take some questions and contributions from the floor. I'd really appreciate it if you keep your contributions quite short so we can get through as many people as possible. And I'm going to do this for about, let's say half an hour first and see how it goes, and then we'll move on to the action planning section. Okay, so I'll take, should I take 3 at a time? If people could switch their phones off, that'd be great. I'll take three questions at a time. So I saw that hand, then that lady in the red top, and then the gentleman at the front. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just ask quickly, under what conditions, in the worst case scenario, will the NHS or could the NHS be exempt from the TTIP?
Okay, great. If when the speakers come to answer, if they could sort of repeat the question, that would be helpful as well, so that everyone can hear. Yeah.
Yeah, if under TTIP, corporations can sue governments if any reversals occur, what would happen in the case of a default if the government was sued and basically they lost the case and then they said, well, we're not going to pay anyway. The corporations, you can go to hell.
Okay.
What would happen then?
Yeah. So the question was, if what happens if a government basically like defies a court order if they're sued or refuses to comply with a court process. When people ask questions, there are these mics. It's difficult to hear at the back, so if you don't have a loud voice, then maybe you push the button, then your voice is amplified. Okay, gentleman at the front.
Call this the front.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ish.
I'm from Keep Our NHS Public, and we are quite clear that we're for exemption of health and social services and against the nasty disputes procedure, the ISDS. I'm sorry, I know that this is on the NHS, but personally, I'm very worried that we can't renationalise rail, energy, Royal Mail, water, and this seems to be a huge problem that needs the whole of the trade union movement and a much wider thing. I'd like to comment on that and where we're going on that. That's a personal question rather than from comp because we're limited to our area.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, so that we're not all repeating ourselves over it. If I pick up the last one, I mean, it isn't just about health. What has been identified, however, within the TUC is that health has been the biggest issue that people have mobilised and been exercised around, and therefore health is a good issue to lead on. However, what follows is also what's the impact on the whole range of public services, and then we get into the debate of what are public services, because the reality is utilities, are they still public services? Well, we could argue, yes, what about national industries elsewhere? So where is the boundary around public services? So that's a debate which is happening in the union movement at the moment, and therefore how far can you do that? Because the reality is state intervention within what are private industries has always been a card that national governments can play, particularly if it's about driving the economy in different directions. So how much intervention can there actually be in the future? And if we're looking at things like health and social services as one aspect, then you've got to talk about the whole pharmaceutical industry, which obviously has a massive impact on the health service. So the whole thing's so interlinked around it, and then obviously regulation around chemicals and the impact that that has on health. So you can't actually kind of pull this thing apart, but health is something that is more likely to motivate people than other parts of the economy, if you like, to address this.
Can I follow? One way you can divide this up will be through at least making sure that we have nationalised the natural monopolies. Anything which has got a big geographical distribution system, or a system in which you need some super specialist and a lot of to cover a big area, and then a lot of grassroots staff like the NHS. That kind of falls into the monopoly pattern, and utilities especially, when you have a choice of your utilities provider, what you're actually doing is selecting which company bills you. Obviously, there's a central supplier, there's only one set of pipes, they don't all lay extra pipes, so you're just choosing which lot get to make the profit out of you. It would be cheaper, definitely, for us to do it communally, but obviously that means that it wouldn't be an opportunity to siphon off funds into the private sector. Shall I pick up one of the others? Or? Okay. What happens if the government doesn't pay up? The country becomes like Cuba or Venezuela or North Korea. In other words, we're public enemy. Because if you drop out of the global trade regime, then the rest of the global trade regime, which is captured by the corporates, will dislike you because you've stood up to them. And so we can see from those countries what the consequences are. Generally, the corporates are pretty good at making sure they've got a control over most governments, and when we topple governments, it's to get back control because somebody started to be disobedient. Our government seems to be really very, very well controlled. You know, they seem to be stamping the leaders out of some sort of factory, clones of them, really. Briefly, under what conditions could the NHS be exempt? I guess our technicals on that might want to give more information than I can. But broadly, on all of the health exemptions in global trade law as well, they're all drawn so as tightly as possible that could be consistent with not being completely fascist. So, you know, for example, hormone-treated beef. People in Europe don't want hormone-treated beef because it's not been tested and it might do horrible things to us, but they managed to have a fight around that. So it's not as clear-cut as you like. On the NHS and public services, the exemption broadly says that if the market's not in there at all, if you can't make money out of it, if it's not a service of economic interest, then it's fine, you can keep it in the public sector. But if anybody can make money at all, if it's been marketised at all, then it can't be exempted. So it needs firstly to be demarketised entirely so that it could qualify for an exemption, and then we need a government who'll hold out to get an exemption, or we need to make enough of a nuisance of ourselves that, you know, they change their minds about their priorities. So briefly, that's the summary of that one.
I'd put the emphasis on making a big enough nuisance of ourselves, because we don't fit in any of the set exemptions at all, but we can demand it. It's not easy to get an exemption in a trade agreement. The French did not get an exemption for audio-visual services. They got, here's something you can tell your public and we'll talk about it later, basically, a pat on the head. But I think this is why it's really important to call for it, because it challenges at the core of the whole thing. It really challenges the core of the public procurement grant, and it challenges the core of the agreement. I don't think we have to fit with their rules.
No.
What they say can be exempt. It's what we want, and then it's up to the people that we pay, the bureaucrats and the politicians, to work out how to get it. It's not an MEP issue in that sense. There's hundreds and hundreds of MEPs. It's a David Cameron issue, and David Cameron would have you know how hard that is, but that's what we need. So obviously, what we really need is an opposition party that's prepared to go for it.
Excuse
like
me.
Lucy said, it's hard for any major party to go against the neoliberal agenda. It's so globally dominant, but that's what we need in this case. Yeah.
Excuse me, is it a fact that the Canadian government managed to get a...
Sorry, is it okay if we follow the process and let people put their hands up? Sorry, otherwise it just becomes a nightmare. Right, I'll do you next. Gentleman at the front, and then lady in the second row.
Thank you. Is it a fact that the Canadian government managed to get...
Sorry.
Is it a fact that the Canadian government managed to get an exemption for their National Health Service? Gentleman at the front.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the last question from the previous tranche and try and extend it a bit. Sorry, I have the mic. I've got my button down. It's just. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I know that.
I think you can actually just press it once. And then
Yeah.
keep your finger
No,
on the
you have to hold it.
Oh, right, okay.
But it's just not working well. Pick up on what Rachel was saying. I am not convinced that the TUC or some members of the Labour Party parliamentary group now pushing the NHS as an isolated case rather than trying to widen our call for exemptions to not just the public sector but public services. Schools, colleges, universities are all vulnerable, for instance. That is not being pushed. I think it would be actually helpful if, rather than concentrating on the NHS alone, yes, fine, we should be doing our utmost to defend that against this kind of attack, but I'm not at all convinced that not widening the case and saying that all the things that constitute a civilised society of the sort that we want to live in are under threat, and that that has an additional appeal. And I think narrowing things is harmful to our case rather than improving it. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, I would like to ask who represents us in the EU and also in the world, you know? Which organizations or which body represent all of us, our interests? And also, I would like to ask you, after all these important meetings, I would like to know which concrete actions we can have, and we can do it, letters, demonstrations, acts that we can do to really contrast this very horrible action. We want that concrete action. You can tell us what is the best, because we don't have the experience about all of that. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's 3. Should we, who?
Shall I hurry on first?
Okay.
Okay, I won't touch the Canadian NHS because I will leave that to Rachel. Should we go for the wider agenda instead of the NHS? Obviously that point has been put quite persuasively because a lot of people have picked that up. That's what the privatisers want us to do, to defocus on the NHS, because their real loser is the NHS. They are dead keen to have us focus on anything but the NHS because they're on much stronger ground with everything else. So, also, as Rachel said, or was it Mel said? 100 billion a year is spent on the NHS. There's really no comparable prize. If you listen to the people who are trying to promote TTIP, what you'll hear is that there are advantages for the automobile industry. Well, I can't really see how a trade agreement is going to sell even one extra car, so presumably labour costs are going to come down, and that's where the gains are. You know, that's marginal if it exists. That's the best they can come up with. What it is a heist on the NHS. And I use the word heist deliberately. They have framed this for us as a legal matter, and everybody's terribly intimidated because there's, you know, a complex set of laws which lawyers don't usually learn. They have to take special courses. In this country, it's not mainstream. It's very technical and highfalutin, and we're all encouraged to think there's all this, you know, superstructure. It's in the nature of a mugging, actually. They buy our governments and get them to do what the buyers want, not what we want. So actually, we don't have to follow their rules or accept their framing at all. It is a mistake, really, and you know, we need to fight on multiple levels. But some people will fight on a technical level, and other people should just say, this is an absolute scam. It's a disgrace. We are being mugged.
Yes.
Who represents our interests in the EU and the world? I have a feeling my fellow panellists may have a different answer, but I'm afraid my cynical answer at this point is we do. Don't expect anybody to fight for you. This privatisation, especially in the NHS, has been very long planned. There is a coherent 30-year plan. And it was organised, spearheaded effectively by Oliver Letwin, who has not repudiated it and is still in charge of implementing it. Now, he wrote at that time a book called Privatising the World. And it sets out as different privatisation strategies we're all familiar with and being told it's something else like, you know, outsourcing and all of these kinds of things, and PFI. All of these are privatisation strategies which he lays out. And one he's very keen to stress is that you must prepare the field by infiltrating key posts. So that's why the medical colleges did nothing, for example. That's why the people that should have stood up haven't stood up. So if you want somebody to do standing up, I'm afraid it's us. However, it is doable and it has been done. I haven't worked as an activist very much in this country. I mostly work overseas, and it is possible to do some quite striking things with not very much if you understand the system and you're organised about it. And in terms of what can we do, again, this is probably going to be a different answer from my fellow panellists, but my personal view is the #1 task. They are doing this secretly. They are waiting for us to find out after it's too late. So, you can order this, queer it very easily. You have mouths. Many of you are online. You have telephones. you can write letters. Please just tell everybody, not just sympathisers, everybody. And as a last point on that, the losers from the loss of the NHS will not just be the poor and the excluded. They're not going to do very well, but the rich aren't going to do terribly well either. Because either their insurance company is going to shaft them when they need it, they have paid thousands and thousands and thousands and they'll wriggle out of it on a legal technicality, or, if they're paying their own bills, they may end up with all kinds of experimental operations they don't need so that they can be billed for them. And that can be fatal. So, everybody's a loser and we're all paying for it. Let's just tell the country. Thank you.
Okay, I can do. If I pick up the couple of issues there and just come back on one or two of things Lucy said, it wasn't that all the Royal Colleges didn't engage.
No, not all of them.
Because obviously we know that things like the Royal College of GPs were very quick out of the blocks in standing up against the Health and Social Care Act. The people who obviously were more silent and completely silenced were those that had a vested interest in practicing in the private sector and therefore obviously seeing the lucrative opportunity that would come out of the Health and Social Care Act for the private side of their work. So I think we need to just be clear. Who do we want to target? Well, the reality is we do have politicians that can bear influence and we can't cut them out of the agenda. We do have to educate them because we know from our campaigning around the Health and Social Care Act, most MPs didn't know what was in the Act. They just went as lobby fodder and went and voted according to what the whip said. So educating MPs in a very simple way. MPs can't take more than one side of A4. So if you're writing to your local MP, make it really, really simple. They don't have time to digest lots of information and detail. So contact them on that level. Also the MEPs will, the whole process will come back to the European Parliament, so make sure that they understand what's happening. The Labour group of European MPs have already said that the ISDS mechanism, which Linda explained, should be totally exempt. They're also supporting the exemption of public services. So, so that's really important. The other thing is, just to say, Labour and Labour's stance on that is that they don't support the public services going out further, but we have to convince them around issues, as I mentioned earlier, about the integrated services like pharmaceuticals. What is health? What isn't health? What are add-on services? With regards to widening the debate, the judgment has been made is that using the example of health is really important because, like no other issue, health has attracted public attention, but that doesn't mean it's the exemption of everything else. So it's not that they don't care about the rest of the public service agenda, because that is equally as lethal. No matter which way you look at it, it will increase inequalities across our society. If it's around education, if it's around social care, and social services. But health is the issue that people bite into because that's a life and death thing. It's like even on the health campaign, we always focus things around emergency services and ambulances. Why? Because people think life and death as opposed to something more long term. So that's why there is a focus on that. I just want to come back onto the point as well around the different other sectors of the economy, particularly things like the automotive industry, which is where the big sell is that there's a gain in that. The reality is, if there is a need to address the issues of tariffs, that can be done outside of this agreement. There can be a separate agreement which looks at things like trade tariffs, if that is a particular issue. This isn't just about tariffs, it's about tariffs and deregulation coupled together. So that is why it's so toxic. So the response back to the manufacturing side, and we're having a debate within Unite, because obviously we represent people right across the economy and we've got to secure jobs as well for our members, is that we need to look at the best way of achieving security around jobs and expansion of our opportunities there, as opposed to using this mechanism just because it's there at the moment and it's convenient. So we need to move that into a different debate rather than predicating it on where we are at the moment. And just finally, just to mention Canada, one of the things the NHS or the Health Service in Canada have taken out of the agreement that they've just signed, CETA, but what we know within that, it was a narrow definition, and therefore the pharmaceutical industry is exempt from, or not exempt from the agreements, and therefore it does have impact around the delivery of clinical services and health outcomes. So that's why broadening the definition is really vital, and to explain that to politicians who might think NHS is out tick, and whether or not we get that, obviously that's a win, but actually saying the consequences of keeping other bits in could be just as dangerous as taking bits out.
The Canadian agreement is still secret, even though it's signed in principle, whatever that means, in October. The text is still secret, so it's pretty hard to know what exactly is in it and out of it. And what the Canadian government is saying to Canadians at the moment, that the health is exempt. Spin's going on all the time, so until you see the text, you don't know. I feel strategically that the NHS should be the focus, because when you look at how they just sold the Royal Mail, and the price of the Mount Pleasant, is it, the land there? That cancelled out the money coming in for it. I mean, it was just, we gave it away. We're so far away from this mass feeling that you're looking at, that strategically we need, I think, to go for the one thing that people can really focus on and care about. And as far as being represented in the EU, as far as I'm concerned, and what I see in the EU, is that it is a corporate mechanism. It's run by corporations. The only way, as far as I'm concerned, the only way is out of the EU, because you can't reform that situation.
Okay, thanks. Right, so I'll take 3 more hands. It's 7:30 or thereabouts. We're good to get a few more rounds in. So the contributions have been kept short. Well done. And maybe when the speakers come back, they can sort of choose a question they feel most interested in, so we can get more questions in. Right, the lady at the front, lady in the second row, and chap in the middle row. Okay.
Really, it's about, you're pointing out that it's individual politics. Oh, sorry.
You suggested, Lucy, that it's individual politicians that in a sense have to be got at. Blair and Cameron have both been served well in the context of this kind of thing by Sir Jeremy Hayward as a Cabinet Secretary, whose wife is a director of McKinsey. And, you know, it's McKinsey that decided that the NHS needed to cut 30 billion. I'm just wondering how far you think our other leaders in waiting might become entangled in that particular web, or will be able to be distanced from it.
Thank you. Please.
Hold it down, Sharon.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want very strongly to endorse what Lucy has said, and anybody else who has said that NHS has to be the focus. It is something that everybody understands. We have examples of where other things have aroused very little interest, and even on the NHS we've seen time and again about how little is done, but we've also seen in Lewisham about how the NHS grabs people, and that people on the ground and locally will actually do something about it. Yes. And Rachel said something about, you know, educating the MPs simply. If those of us who've been in the campaign for years, our experience has been what an enormous uphill struggle. It might have well have been Everest to get people to understand and then to do something about it. We have to do the same with our MPs, but you see, we can't educate them on a whole range of issues, and we're falling prey to their game if we go in for that. And I'm very tempted to ask, with all due respect, when will we ever learn? You know, the NHS is the thing, and it's the example that covers everything else. I just want to say 2 other things. One is what we're leaving out of account, and I think it's interesting. The BBC is a public service. They could be under threat too. The BBC has been betraying us for the last, I don't know how many years. And how many people have been doing anything about it? I've been going on about this in every meeting. You can ring them up and play Merry Hell with them. You can leave messages, and you can demand an answer in writing. Hassle them, hassle them, hassle them. It's the easiest thing in the world to do, and people don't do it. You can sit in your armchair with your feet up. You can lie in
bed, half finishing your breakfast, and ring them up. You have to ring them up every single time they say something or fail to do something, and that's the only way to do it. They won't move otherwise. And finally, I want to say that I was in a meeting earlier today with Diane Abbott. It was a small meeting at Hackney Pensions Convention, and we had 5 questions. Only one of them was on the NHS. I have to tell you that it's a very small body, Hackney Pensions Convention, and a while ago they actually voted against spending £20 to join Keep Our NHS Public. Now, if people like that who come to meetings once a month need convincing about the NHS, then you tell me how you're going to convince them about all this other stuff, okay? And actually, in the National Pensions Convention London region, people were telling me, you're going on too much, you're packing too much in, you're telling people too much, and people were arguing that Transport for London was more important. You know, so, you know, let's bear that in mind, the reality of the thing. Now, the reality is, Diane Abbott said this afternoon, oh, I'm sorry, it nearly makes me want to weep, you know. She can't see the difference between repealing the bill and reversing the legislation. She thinks the two words are interchangeable and synonymous. Repeal, she said, we're going to reverse it. I said, that's not what Andy Burnham's saying. Well, repeal, reverse is the same. Okay. Now, people tell me she's not stupid, so I don't know what the answer is to that. She didn't answer the question about a commitment to abolish PFIs. She also said, and this is interesting in view of the expertise on the panel, local authorities have been bringing things back in-house. So, you know, when you come to renew the contract, the NHS can do that too. I said the legislation won't let you. When the contract is due for renewal, she said, we can give it. I said, you know, you'll be sued and so on and so on. She doesn't want to know, or she does. I don't understand. So finally, and people can think this cynical if you like, Andy Burnham has been sticking his head out, saying he's going to do this if he's Minister of Health, and so on and so on. If you've noticed, I've noticed, I hope I'm not the only one, nobody else in the leadership is backing him, right? He's not going to be Minister of Health. So they will simply not be betraying anything when they don't make him Minister of Health if the Labour government gets in. Now, why would somebody like Andy Burnham be in the process of destroying his political career by standing up there saying everything that the leadership don't agree with? And I'll tell you what I think. You can shoot me down in flames if you want to, probably a lot of people will. I think he's made a deal. I think he's made a deal with the leadership. He doesn't mind if he's not Minister of Health. He'll take the Foreign Office, he'll take the Home Office, or the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or whatever you like. And so he won't be betraying any promises either, because he won't be able to do anything. But he's standing up there, flying a kite, trying to convince us that the Labour Party is serious about the NHS. If you believe that, you'll believe anything.
Quite concise. That would be quite shorter. That was concise, but shorter. That would be great. Thanks very much. I can't remember who's. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, I'm from South East London, and I'd like to say first something positive. We've had a very good response on the streets, leaflets for public meetings, and also petitions. We've had petitions against Serco and G4S, and they've gone down a storm. I'm talking about 170 signatures in 2 hours. People hate G4S and Serco. They've got relatives that have suffered under these companies. We're pushing on an open door if we work in this way. But now to problems. I'm from South East London, but the problem is I recognise maybe a fifth of the people in here. We very much need to get the message out, okay? The problem that we have, I think that, you know, all the front bench politicians, whatever party, I think they're all rabbits in the headlights when it comes to the big corporations. They're useless. They're going to do nothing unless we press them. Rachel mentioned trade unions having a debate about what's a public service and what's not a public service. Don't take this personally, but as far as the trade unions are concerned, is this a diversion from actually making a noise and saying this stuff's about to happen? What I really would like to see is posters, big posters in the street, single page adverts in the press. This is a horror story that we're facing. We need publicity. We need to get this story out there. Where is the trade union leadership?
These are the aspects.
Okay. Ideally, maybe one of you could take each of those points.
One was for me.
Yeah, one was certainly for you. Yeah. Do you want to go first, Linda? Because you have gone last on your points.
I don't think Shirley asked. I don't think Shirley asked a question. I think she made some good points. No, it's a, no, go for it, Lucy.
Okay, right. Thank you very much for a specific question for me, and also this wraps in a little bit of the last questioner's points as well. Should we be getting at individual politicians? Well, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding really about how policy making works in this country. We've all been told that we elect MPs and then they make policies. Well, if you have a look at what's going on in the houses, there's debates, but people aren't in them. They don't use that as their criteria for voting. And you look at the decisions that come out, and those aren't in the public interest, and they don't seem to be able to justify them at all. Really, what's happening in Westminster is that policies are sold to us. So where do they come from? Well, it seems, and if you're lucky, Linda may talk to you about the specifics of this, because she knows more about this than I do, but there is a committee in the City of London called the Liberalisation of Trade in Services Committee, which tackles such matters as this. And it's full of city corporations, you know, all the different bits of the financial services industry, legal firms, that kind of thing. It's you know, an agglomeration of money. It's the city and the market, as we talk of in this country. And two little chaps from the DTI, quite junior people, turn up. They don't need to send anybody senior because their role is just to write things down, and they take back the policies. That goes into the DTI. But that's where the policy agenda for our country is coming. So lobbying politicians to make them change their mind isn't probably relevant. Humiliating them with the transparency of their spin might be a lot more effective, really, because they're supposed to be effective salespeople. And if you can get the message out, what's going on, it's a corporate agenda and Cameron's lying again, and if people start to pick that up, well, you know, maybe you are making a hit on the politicians, but do not expect changing their opinion to change anything. They don't control it. There are some fantastic people in Westminster, some of whom care deeply about the NHS and are doing their utmost. But it doesn't matter because the power is concentrated in the top blocks and those are securely held. And I would like to mention the mechanism by which they are securely held, and I will not make specific allegations about this country. I will refer to a report from Joseph Stiglitz, formerly the chief economist of the World Bank, who was fired for noticing that the policies produce perverse effects which were very unpleasant for beneficiary populations and seeking to do some research into the matter to see if they should be recommending something else. So they fired him for that. Top economist. He had a conversation with an investigative journalist called Greg Palast, which is documented in the book The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. And that talks about the privatisation process in Africa. And he explains how the IMF people went from country to country, and in each country they'd explain the deal to the politicians, and you could see apparently their eyes light up with pleasure as it was explained to them that just for a small reduction in the cost of the sale price for the public assets, they could have a largish sum deposited in a Swiss bank account for their future security, and they were mostly delighted with that. Apparently, only one country told them where they could stick that offer, because they were trying to do the right thing for their people. Now that country, I had a student from that country last year, and I'm quite familiar with Africa, I've worked there a lot, and I've got a kind of a general sub-Saharan Africa spiel, but when I was talking to her, and she was talking to me about her country, which sits right in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa, it was plain that I was talking about the third world, and she was talking about somewhere which ran pretty much like here. It was a first world country. That country is Botswana. It is 70% desert. It has no coastline, so it's landlocked. That's a big disadvantage economically. It's got diamonds. So's most of Africa got some diamonds, and the diamonds have brought it 25% HIV positive rate. Nevertheless, it is the richest country on the continent and the best organised, and all it had going for it was that it had a clean government when the IMF came calling to do these deals. We have got the same problem as sub-Saharan Africa, except Botswana.
Great, thanks. Do you want to say a few words, or
Yeah.
if not? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back on 2 points. One is about politicians and one is about trade unions. On the issue of politicians, I totally agree, not all politicians can be put in the same pot. And I'm somebody who is working very closely with Andy Burnham on the health policy moving forward, and I have to say I don't take the view that's been expressed here today. There is a genuine commitment. Andy Burnham cannot make pronouncements without the leadership's buy-in to that. So what you hear from his voice is also Labour Party policy coming out. So he has got the support of the leadership behind what he is saying. So I will put that very fairly and squarely out there. And we are trying to put together the most progressive health agenda we possibly can. And I have to say, as a trade union, we've obviously been working with that, as we do day to day, in raising the issues that our members do with us. And therefore, I don't think it is right. Yes, we are right to judge our politicians, we're right to hold them to account, but I don't think it's right to make judgment on what individuals are doing and trying to manoeuvre through the system to try and get the best outcomes possible. So all I would say is I think what we have to wait is see what's in that manifesto, and that's going to be developed over the next few months. Anybody can feed into that, party members. If you are outside of the political process, you won't have a view of what Labour Party policy is because you've chosen not to engage with that process. But if you are in the Labour Party, you can engage in that process and therefore can determine the future. So part of it is about...
If you're in the Labour Party, are you in the political process?
This is ahistorical, what you're saying. The Labour Party sell out.
Well, okay, I've seen the paper going forward, and there is a lot of positive within it.
Like that. We're all political in this room, or we wouldn't be here.
I'm not talking about...
Okay, let's just put that point to one side, because I can see where that's going, and it's not going to be a very productive discussion.
Can I answer on Diane Abbott very briefly, because it was a specific point and it's an important one?
Very briefly.
Right, yes, okay. So her point is, when the contract's up, you just renew it back to the public sector. The problem is that there isn't any provision to pay the public sector workforce during the time the company has got the contract, so the public sector unit won't exist when it comes round for contract renewal. They're conveniently not mentioning that, but it's not going to be an unexpected effect, let's say.
Lucy, I think you'd agree, though, that they can't just bring it back into the public sector while Section 75 is on the books, because until that is repealed, and it has to be repealed, then they just won't be able to do that.
Sure, but there's the zero volume contract thing on waiting for expiry. I think that's what Diane Abbott's trying to hook into, but the fact is there won't be the public, it's going to be starved of budgets. There's no way to keep it living without these contracts.
Okay, I'd just like to get just one final round of questions, and then some very brief reflections on those from the speakers, and then the action planning bit, which is the most important part of the evening. So I'm going to go to the two people in the back row, and the lady over there. So I think the first lady had red hair.
Given that this is a European issue, is there any mileage for linking up with trade unions and pressure groups in other countries to coordinate an attack on TTIP?
Okay.
Thank you. I'm from Lewisham People for Profit. I think any cynicism about the Labour Party and the NHS and privatisation is well placed. I mean, I'm amazed by the dearth of information about this EU-US trade agreement. I see nothing in the papers, nothing on the TV. The Labour Party aren't talking about it at all. Louisa Irvine from the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign raised it in a discussion with Andrew Neil the other day, and I don't think he'd heard of it, or either that or he just had an agenda not to discuss it. But in terms of my question is, though, in the very limited press coverage, there was something in The Independent the other day and I think Linda mentioned this about the EU Trade Commissioner launching a major public consultation about the investor-state dispute settlement. Does that have any meaning at all? Is that something we can engage with, or is it just you know, some meaningless thought? Thank you.
Thank you. And the lady over there.
Not wanting to focus it at the fractions that were going on just now.
Sorry, I had meant that the lady towards the back. Sorry.
Right, okay. Just one point on Labour. I don't really trust them, as I've heard that Alan Milburn is back as strategist for 2015, according to The Guardian, and he was the arch privatiser under Blair of the NHS. So that's a worry. Secondly, I understand that the gagging law has gone through, and in that context, perhaps it's a good idea to actually get behind somebody that the National Health Action Party, because they're actually a political group campaigning for the NHS, and there's a possibility that they won't be shut down using that law. Third thing I want to just mention is I'm wondering if the panel's aware of social impact bonds, which seems to me a massive PFI scheme whereby that was talked about by the government at the G8, is pioneered by a chap who's known as the founder of private equity in Britain. And it's where private equity and philanthropists get together and invest in charities. They make a deal and invest in charities to provide preventative services, say to prevent people going into hospitals, people using social services, and get paid back by the government at a percentage, with a percent. That seems to me like a PFI, and I wondered if the panel are aware of that. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, Linda, can you go first? Thanks.
About European action, there is a joined up European campaign going on. So with NGOs in Europe and US, that is happening. There is a joining up of the trade unions, but I have to say that they're not that forthright on TTIP. I don't see the ETUC really coming out against it. Although some aspects of it, yes. The dearth of information, that's quite deliberate. I mean, there's more information, well, not really more information. There is actually more public debate on this trade agreement than any of the others. The others have been dead quiet. I always think that the whole trade agenda is about secrecy and spin. If you can't keep it secret as much as you can, if it comes out at all, you spin it, and then if that doesn't work, you wrap it up in technical language, and that's usually enough to keep it right off the screen. And it has worked for all these years. It's worked. And the key thing with these sorts of trade agreements, as opposed to stuff in the WTO, if you remember those big demonstrations with the WTO, partly because they were global, partly because the issues were out there in the public sphere. When they shifted to bilaterals, the whole thing is secret until it's completed. So there's nothing there for the media or NGOs or anything to hang on, apart from the official press releases as each round of negotiations. There's just nothing there to get into. Only leaked documents are coming out, but officially it's all secret until it's completed. And the TTIP involves practically 1 billion people and half the world's GDP, and yet it's secret. That's incredible, isn't it? I'll leave the Trade Commission's consultation. I'm extremely cynical about it. Obviously, NGOs and that will put in for it, but like I say, it's announced in January. It's not going to start till March. It's going to go on for a long time. In the meantime, all the other aspects of the trade agreement are being negotiated, and it's only about loopholes in ISDS. It's not about getting, it's not about consultation about whether you want to get rid of it or not. It's a bit shocking to see Francis O'Grady from heading up the TUC had a conversation with the Trade Commissioner in Brussels. So the Trade Commission press releases are saying that it's just about loopholes. She had a conversation with de Gucht in Davos, and the TUC rushed out a press release saying pretty much, here's the chance to get rid of ISDS. This is what de Gucht has told me, and it's thanks to the unions. So this sort of like grabbing credit where there's no credit to be had, really. So the Trade Commission was just using the TUC, who they could count on to sort of big themselves up and promote themselves, but absolute bullshit, really. So no, I don't think a lot about the consultation myself.
Okay, and very brief comments from other two speakers.
Okay, yeah, I will pick up the issue around trade unions as well. I mean, the reality is it's not that trade unions are silent, and picking up the point that you made earlier. It's just that we've got an incredibly right-wing press in this country that doesn't want to report what trade unions are often saying.
Billboards? How about billboards?
Well, there is a reality. We've just looked at the cost of putting an ad in national papers, and we'll blow a serious amount of our budget. We don't have that kind of resource to compete with those kind of companies. But what I was going to say is we have got new forms of media which we have to utilise to the full. The reality is ads in papers, billboards, they last as long as they last, but that continued messaging, using social media, getting out there, talking locally, using our networks, that is a far more effective way, more sustainable. And the reality, we then report the stories that we want to report, rather than just having that window of opportunity come and gone in a day, a newspaper ad, and hundreds of thousands of pounds down the drain. So that's the reality of what we have to balance out within the trade union as well. And our members have to determine how we spend our money. So obviously we have to take a lead from our members the way that we do that. But we've all got access to media in this new world, and we have to maximise that and utilise that to move things forward. On the issue about the engagement of trade unions, it's like all issues, it's around literacy. And the fact is that the literacy on TTIP, and Lyndon will know that I've been kind of coming to her and saying, I want to know about TTIP, I want to understand it, I want to get my head around it. But we need to do that. We all need to do that. That's why you're here tonight, is to try and expand your knowledge base. And the reality is that has to happen right across the movement. And we've all got a role to play in that, in talking to our colleagues and spreading that message out. You now are empowered with information that you can go out wider and further afield through your networks, socially and virtual networks, as well as real people networks. And then you are going to be agents of change, taking that message forward. So it's everybody's responsibility doing that, including to your trade union leaders, your lead activists, and your friends and colleagues.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks. In terms of any organisations, I think we probably are going to get out of them what we put in. You better push people hard if you want actual representation, because it must be awfully tempting to buy those people out from the other side. And there's evidence that seems to be happening in many areas. So if you don't just count on organisations which you think should be representing you. Thank you very much for the comments on the social impact bonds. There have been a number of different private sector arrangements involving charities. They're very keen on charities because charities get people to work for free. I've also seen a commissioning arrangement where a joint bid was put in with a big corporate and a largest charity, and the largest charity said afterwards, well, we did our part, but they basically stiffed us and it cost us more to participate than we made out of it. So in the end, they're participating in that bid allowed the corporate to say, oh, we've got a charity on board, nice branding game, and then they were able to raid the charity's coffers. So yes, I think there's a lot on charities. You need to be very cynical about the labels charity and social enterprise at the moment. Lastly, the TTIP message is suppressed. Yes, it is suppressed. It is essential to suppress it. It is also essential that we all think of it as a matter of trade and as a matter of law. What we need to do is have it understood by everyone in the country as a matter of corruption. We wouldn't be getting this if they hadn't bought our politicians.
Can't you get on Channel 4 or BBC? Get Jeremy Paxman or something.
I denounced Long Warner live live on BBC at one point. Sorry you missed
Well
it.
done, Linda was interviewed by the artist Taxi Driver, if people know him. Share that video. I'm afraid, I'm really sorry, loads of people put their hands up, and I want to move on to the action planning section, because it's as I said, it's the most important part of the evening. So, how we actually build this massive popular campaign to defeat the TIP, or at the very least exempt the NHS from TIP. So I'm going to ask if Linda could say a few words just to open up this section.
I'm assuming that most people are supportive of the idea of calling for an exemption of the NHS from the trade agreement. So I'm quite convinced that when people hear about this, they just generally go with the idea. Our challenge is how to channel that into something that hits hard enough to have an effect. So that is the challenge. There is some view that trying to stop the agreement is more important, or that this somehow is contradictory to trying to stop the agreement to call for the exemption. But in practical terms, it is, as we've acknowledged, there is very little knowledge about the agreement anyway. So this, strategically, this is a very good way to raise awareness of the actual agreement. I can say that because I've been banging on about trade for about 12, 13, 14 years, and nobody has wanted to know until it affects the NHS. So it's that good a thing to ride on for the whole trade agreement. It hits at the heart of the public procurement, which is a really big part of the trade agenda, but that part is kept really quiet. So I guess I'm thinking for sure that we want some, from this meeting, that we want some ongoing thing, whether an ongoing general meeting. This is just my idea, that we want some ongoing general public meetings, or if we want a committee of people who can move things, say union people, 38 degrees, comp. So that's the sort of two ways forward, maybe both, or that's the 2 ways forward that I'm thinking of. In terms of information, there is pieces of paper up the back that is point form information about the trade agreement, not specifically NHS, but I know it's quite hard to understand the whole trade agreement stuff if you're just coming at it, so it's in point form there, a lot of the stuff that I've said. There's also a draft letter there that someone, Sean, drafted for MEPs that shows that you know about the issue, so it might be quite useful from that point of view, and could double up with MPs too.
Okay, thanks. Just to remind people, STOPTTIP meets here every 2 weeks. So the next meeting will be in 2 weeks' time from now. And you're welcome to come along to those meetings. They're at 6:30 until 8:30 every Monday. Every other Monday. We also have a mailing list, and I did circulate the list at the beginning of the meeting. So yeah, great. Okay, they're at the back there. Do either of the representatives from Comp want to sort of say anything at this point about? Okay, yeah, thanks.
I'm from Greenwich Comp, and in the summer we had a leaflet done about this trade, and it's gone out quite widely. But also we had a leaflet about the BBC and its charter, because our biggest problem is the media. I was listening to a religious discussion yesterday morning, and they said it's the people of this country want all the immigration problems. It's not the people, it's the media that puts the thoughts, because they don't read much else, the people. And we have been talking about a BBC lobby, a lock in, a lock out. That means we go there a particular time, so the staff can't get out and another lot can't get in, but at the same time we have banners and leaflets, and we inform all the other international media to come and see it, because we keep on being told about the freedom and the rights of other countries. And tonight, if you see, has the NUS been spoken to? Because we haven't got the youth, and the NUS is under great pressure. There's been sit-ins all along, up and down the country for privatisation of their debts, and yet there's nothing on the media. So the media is strangling all our democratic rights and information. We'll not be given information. And I think something to do with the BBC and a lock in, a lock out to a particular day and time. We can plan for that properly, UK Uncut, but certainly the youth. And I'd like to know whether the reps and the shop stewards of the union, not just Unite, are actually being talked to about this. And I'm also in C&D. Now C&D had a campaign, you get enough money for adverts on a bus. They also got enough money for adverts going, and I saw them myself down in Euston on those things, advertising, no to try them. Surely we can ask how many thousand trade unionists, £1 each, and that would bring a special fund for getting this over. Because if not, our whole life is ruined, especially for future generations. So, but I really feel a mass demonstration outside of organised and well done. I know time was short, but with banners and saying, what about the trade agreement? We demand a discussion and a debate. We demand our MPs inform the public.
Yeah.